This crime captivated the nation, put the nation on its ear, and had probably hundreds and hundreds of thousands of households going through their medicine cabinets to try to determine, do we have poison in our house?
Next week marks 40 years since the Tylenol murders shook Chicago and the nation.
Decades later, it remains a cold case, or is it?
In tonight's special report, Dane Placco looks back at the deadly poisonings and talks with some former feds who think they know who did it.
That bizarre mystery of Tylenol laced with cyanide still has not been solved tonight.
Investigators say they are searching for, quote, a madman.
When you opened a bottle of Tylenol in the early 1980s, or any product for that matter, you didn't see this protective seal. Now it's the law because of what happened in the Chicago area starting on September 29th, 1982.
I think looking at this story, they're going to kind of open their eyes and say, I never knew that happened here in Chicago.
In a matter of days, the death toll mounted.
7 people have now died. A health official said, we're dealing with Russian roulette.
All the bottles of extra-strength capsules were removed Friday as part of the nationwide recall.
Do not take any Tylenol until further notice.
That was the year they canceled Halloween because of the poisoning. And everybody was afraid that their child would pick up the candies that were poisoned.
40 years later, we sat down with 2 retired Chicago FBI agents who originally worked the Tylenol case and the former Chicago special agent in charge who initiated a reinvestigation of the case in 2009. They all believe they know who did it.
I think it's solved. I can't go into that detail because it's not public.
I believe that it's solved.
I think there's sufficient evidence to go forward.
Police are looking for disgruntled employees, angry customers, anybody with a grudge against the stores or Tylenol.
Early on, there were few, if any, leads. Then this man became the focus of police. In 1984, former Chicagoan James Lewis was convicted on federal extortion charges for sending this anonymous letter to Johnson & Johnson shortly after the poisonings, demanding $1 million to stop the killings.
And the jury was out a half hour before they came in and convicted him.
Lewis spent 11 years in prison for the shakedown, but through the decades has denied being responsible for the murders.
I think the Tylenol murderer is still out there dancing in the streets.
He even reached out to federal agents following his conviction, offering to help them solve the case.
We had a profiler tell us that one of the points of the profile is that this person who might be involved in the poisoning will contact an investigator.
Roy Lane was one of the FBI's lead case agents for the Tylenol investigation. Jeremy Margolis was an assistant U.S. attorney who prosecuted Lewis on the extortion charge. They met with Lewis several times after the trial. During one of those meetings, they say Lewis gave them a sketch of how he thought the killer put the cyanide in the Tylenol capsules. So what happened to that information?
Well, the FBI's got it. It's sitting in the case files. I don't know that they'll tell you whether it was helpful or not. I'll just describe it as extremely interesting.
What's also interesting is how the FBI decided to reinvestigate the case 15 years ago.
2006, 2007, at the time, I was the public affairs director for the FBI office in Chicago, and the 25th anniversary of the poisonings was coming up, and I was contacted by a local reporter that I dealt with extensively over the years, and he had taken up this case as what he called a hobby.
So Rice arranged for a meeting at the FBI Chicago field office.
And he laid out his theory, and it was very well thought out, and he had some, I guess you would call, evidence to support it. And we thanked him for coming in and excused him, and right away Roy said that wasn't possible.
I think the quote was, "That's not the guy. We know who did it." That's what I remember.
Even though they disagreed with the reporter's suspicions, the meeting sparked a critical question.
Where is this person that we think did it? And then we ran an investigative report and found he was in jail for alleged violent crimes that he was never convicted of.
Which Grant says meant it was time to use new forensic tools to find the killer.
We had to sort of re-look at the investigation. That means recontacting 5 other police departments, including the state police, and see what everybody had. It may behoove us to take that evidence from 25 years ago and reapply it through the FBI laboratory. And that's how we started the investigation.
Coming up in our special report tomorrow night, we'll take a look at what that reinvestigation revealed and what prosecutors did with it. Dane Placco, Fox 32 Chicago.
As a result of the Tylenol murders, Congress passed federal product tampering laws in 1984. Still ahead. This month marks 40 years since 7 Chicago area residents died of poisoning after taking Tylenol capsules laced with cyanide. No one has ever been charged with those murders. In tonight's special report, Dane Placco talks with 3 former federal agents who worked on that case. They say the question now isn't who did it, but why the case has not been charged.
I think the encouraging thing is that they really look like they're really trying to close the case. And I almost got the impression that potentially, they may be close to something.
That was the hope of Jack Eliason in February 2009 when the FBI revved up its investigation into Chicago's infamous Tylenol murders.
Investigators say they are searching for, quote, a madman.
Jack's sister, Mary McFarland, was one of 7 Chicago area residents who died after taking Tylenol capsules tainted with cyanide in the fall of 1982.
Over the years, you just thought, nobody cares, it's done, they can't find anything.
Can you give us any idea what you're looking for?
That fresh look at the case started when agents served a search warrant on the Cambridge, Massachusetts home of James Lewis, who in 1984 was convicted of writing this letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the Tylenol killings. Lewis spent 11 years in prison for extortion, but was never charged with the murders and has always denied being the killer.
I think the Tylenol murderer is still out there dancing in the street.
It's 40 years, and we, the 3 of us here and other task force members, believe we have enough evidence to convict a person.
Retired FBI agents Roy Lane and Ross Rice and former special agent in charge Rob Grant were instrumental in that reinvestigation taking place. In addition to searching that home in Cambridge, they also formed a task force of all the local law enforcement agencies involved in the original case to pull all the evidence together and examine it with new forensic tools.
That was a couple of years in the undertaking. Some of the evidence state police had not seen, some of the evidence the FBI had not seen. So this was, in some cases, the first time some of these agencies had seen some of the evidence that had been collected by other people.
By 2012, the federal agents believed they'd built a strong case against a suspect and brought it to 2 local state's attorneys.
The evidence in totality was presented to Anita Alvarez of Cook County and to Robert Berlin at DuPage County. They are knowledgeable and are in the possession of many of the witness statements.
At the time, the task force was attempting to do certain things and needed their cooperation.
So how did that meeting with Alvarez and Berlin end?
Ended with, we'll get back to you.
Grant retired from the FBI 10 years ago and regrets that charges were never brought.
The task force is satisfied there's enough of a case here to at least throw it to a jury and let a jury decide whether we've made the case or not.
But that's a decision only a prosecutor can make. Generally speaking, most don't like to charge a case unless they think they can win at trial.
Lewis always has suggested there was somebody else out there who did it. Our conclusion is it was Lewis who did it, period.
Anton Valukas is a former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. He is one of 2 prosecutors who wrote a letter to the U.S. Parole Commission in 1989, asking them to deny parole for James Lewis when he was serving his prison sentence for extortion.
And we supplied them in that letter with information that we had, some of it public, others not public, which led us to the reasonable belief that Lewis was, in fact, the murderer.
Valukas says his letter included conversations Lewis had with the FBI and federal prosecutors after his conviction, when Lewis offered to help them solve the case.
And I think, Lewis, with his ego, showing you how he could do it. And we concluded it was not only how you could do it, but how he did it.
Based in part on Valukas' letter, the Parole Commission denied Lewis's parole request in 1989, concluding that he was indeed the Tylenol murderer. In 1991, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that decision. But Valukas says whether that evidence is strong enough to win a conviction is still in question.
And my belief is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the difference.
The family members of the victims are entitled to some closure, but until there's a prosecution, until someone is charged and hopefully convicted, there really is no closure for them.
Today, Grant makes the same plea to prosecutors he did in 2012.
Give it its due attention and run the risk that you may fail, but charge this case before witnesses are gone.
We reached out to DuPage County State's Attorney Bob Berlin and former Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez about that 2012 meeting. Berlin sent us a statement that says, in part, the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office has worked tirelessly with state, local, and federal law enforcement officials to bring the person or persons responsible for the Tylenol murders to justice, and that the case remains an open and active investigation. Alvarez has not yet responded to our request for comment. Dane Placco, Fox 32 Chicago.
We also reached out to Lewis's attorney about our story. He declined to comment.
As for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, they also say this case remains an open and active investigation.